Welcome everyone to another NASCAR Heat Evolution setup video. In this video, we'll be taking a look at Richmond International Raceway. And before we jump into the setup, let's go ahead and take a look at lap times to begin with. First and foremost, the AI at 105% or max difficulty will qualify at this track at about a 20.9 second lap, 20.9 seconds. And the lap times I've been able to get with the particular setup you're seeing right now is anywhere from a 21.1 to about a 21.3, depending on how hard I run the car, and as opposed to different things like which line I'm running, how hard I'm braking, getting into the corner, that kind of thing. So anywhere from a 21.1 to a 21.3, and that seems to be very much in line with what the AI at max difficulty run during a race setting. Definitely not running away from them by any stretch on a normal lap basis, but at the same time, they're not running away from me either. So it should make for a pretty good race. Let's go ahead and jump into the setup itself. As you can see from the top left-hand corner, starting with the shock settings, everything is 10 across the boards, as is pretty normal for me. I don't tend to mess around with shocks a whole lot. I like to start right in the middle. Now, that's not to say that they don't make any difference or you shouldn't mess around with them. My general advice would be that would be the last thing you tend to mess around with. So in keeping with that, I generally don't mess around with those for the setups that I post. And in general, haven't really found much of a reason to deal with them in general, although they definitely will have effects on the setup. Moving on to the weight settings, the left weight, because this once again is an oval and we're only turning left, we max out the amount of left weight at 54.2%. Moving on to the front weight, this is something that you can definitely play around with. Front weight will affect how tight or loose the car is overall, because it will determine how quickly the car wants to rotate. The higher this number, the slower the car will want to rotate, the more it will want to push the nose in the corners. So I settled on 50.5, which is a little bit higher than I figured I would, simply because it adds some stability to the car. You're going to hear that word stability a lot in this video, as you do traditionally through most of my videos, because my setups are generally not the fastest. However, I build them to be very stable because I build them to race with and not simply to put down a hot lap or a qualifying lap with. So these are the setups that I race with rather than just trying to go out and wildly run a lap to see what the quickest time is I can get. So I decided on 50.5 there. If you find that the car is not rotating as much as you would like, feel free to lower that number, and that will definitely help the car to turn, particularly on corner entry. The wedge number, I typically like to keep this at 50% or above, again for stability. But in this case, as was the case for Phoenix that I posted video on most recently, I found that the car simply wasn't turning to my liking at 50 to 50.5%. So I had to go down to, I tested as low as, I believe 49%, 49.0 was as low as I got on this number. And that made the car out of control in the center. Basically, the car was over rotating and getting loose throughout the corner. So I decided to increase that number and finally decided on 49.5%. The front and rear ride heights are both at the minimums, no changes there. Although I will tell you that not as much on a short track, but on a bigger track, if you run larger numbers on particularly in the rear of the car, it can make the car a little bit tighter, give it a little bit more rear grip. Spring settings, the left front spring is maxed out at 1,200 pounds, with the right front spring a couple of hundred pounds below that at 1,000, and that is to help the car turn on entry. Now you have to be careful with the amount of split you run in the front springs anytime you're under heavy braking, which Richmond is definitely one of those places where you're going to be using the brakes really heavy on entry. And the reason you have to be careful with it is because you like to keep the front springs particularly as even as or close to even as you can, because it can cause an imbalance and cause the car to turn to the left or to the right pretty hard uh, when there's an imbalance in the springs in the front. So keep that in mind if you adjust the front springs. I found that just using a couple of 100 pounds of split from 1,200 to 1,000 pounds in the front really didn't cause too much of an issue. But if you feel like the car is pulling particularly too hard to the left on heavy braking, then you would either want to reduce the left front or increase the right front to help that out. In the rear of the car, I have 150 pounds of rear spring split going 350 pounds in the left rear, 500 pounds in the right rear. I find that that was the best balance of allowing the car to turn, particularly from the center of the corner off when under heavy throttle, but it also allowed the car to be under control, and the car didn't over rotate and get loose on corner exit as well. So there's a trade-off to be had there. The more split you run in the rear of the car, let's say if I lowered the left rear to around 300 pounds, or if I increased the right rear above 500 pounds, then that would definitely help the car turn, particularly from the center of the corner off. But you run the risk of getting the car so loose that you're turning right the entire way off the corner. And that's not something I want, particularly under race conditions when I'm around a bunch of other cars. Let's move on to the tire pressure settings. And this is something that you can definitely mess around with to get the car feeling the way you want it to feel. As you can see, I'm using 15 pounds for both left sides, 25 pounds for both right side tire pressures. That 10-pound split between left and right worked out good. Theoretically, I would like to use more than that, maybe 15 or even 20 pounds of difference to help the car turn, because you need the car to turn and rotate so quickly here because you're under heavy braking going into the corner, but after just a second off the throttle, you're right back on it very hard. So theoretically, you'd like the car to rotate even better. But I found that using any more split than about 10 pounds, it was making the car too loose for me and too erratic on and off the throttle. So I finally settled on these numbers. Again, feel free to play around with these numbers. If the car is too loose, then one of the things you can do is reduce the split here. Either increase the left sides up to around 20 or reduce the right sides down to around 20. Anything like that that reduces the difference between the left side pressures and right side pressures will tighten up the car. The car won't rotate quite as quickly throughout the corner. And let's move over to the right hand side of the screen with the miscellaneous settings. The left front and right front cambers are maxed out as is normal with all my setups to this point. And that is because basically the car seems to continue gaining grip the more camber I use, so I've found no reason to reduce these numbers. However, I do want to warn you, as many people have pointed out on previous videos, this does make the car pull very hard to the left. So if you're on the straightaway and the car is pulling very hard to the left, the camber is one of the main culprits for that. So if you want to reduce that pull to the left, then one of the things you can do is reduce the amount of camber. So take the left front from a +10 to about a +2, and similar thing for the right front. Take it from a -10 to about a -2, and then see what difference you see in the car. Let's move on to the sway bar. Front sway bar I have at 1.5 inches. Again, I had tested out using less than that, going down to about 1.1 or so. And the problem for me is it just got the car too erratic. The car didn't behave as nice as I wanted it to and stable as I wanted it to behave for race conditions. So I stuck with 1.5. That seemed to be a pretty good compromise. Too much more than 1.5. The closer you get to 2 inches, 1.75, whatever the case may be, it makes the car too tight and the car doesn't want to rotate, particularly on entry and through the center of the corner. And if I get too much below 1.5, the car starts to want to spin out under heavy braking and through the center. So 1.5 was a pretty good compromise. As normal, I'm not using the rear sway bar. That's not to say that the rear sway bar can't be a valuable tool for you, as it will help the rear of the car to rotate, particularly from the center off of the corner. But in the case of my setups, I try to shy away from that because it tends to make the car a little less stable for me based on how I drive. But definitely feel free to play around with the rear sway bar and see how it affects the handling for you. Let's move on to the track bar. As you can see, I'm using a little bit of a reverse setting on the track bar, with the left side track bar being at 11 inches and the right side being a full inch below that at 10 inches. The reason I do that is because the higher the left side track bar, that tends to help the car on corner entry to turn and rotate, while accompanying that with a lower right side setting that tends to keep the car a little bit tighter and more snug on corner exit. So what that enabled me to do on this particular setup is, by using higher left side than right side track bar, it enabled me to get more aggressive with other settings like the rear spring split or using a lower wedge number, things like that, to help the car turn, and use the track bar to keep the car underneath me on corner exit. Brake bias, I finally settled on 71. Anywhere from 70 to about 72, 73% seems to work well for me. Again, the higher number you use on the brake bias, the more the car will want to go straight whenever you brake. So essentially what brake bias is it's the percentage of front brake in the car. So in this case, 71% of the brake pressure in the car is on the front tires. So the more pressure you have on the front tires, the more the car wants to go straight. And at Richmond, this translates into a tighter car on corner entry. The lower that brake bias number, you're putting more brake pressure on the rear of the car, which helps the car to rotate under braking, with, of course, the danger there being that the car starts to get loose as you can even lock up the rear tires and spin out under braking. But again, a number anywhere from 70 to about 72 or 73 generally works pretty well for me. Grill tape right now is at 0% because, as I've mentioned in previous video, in fact, I did an entire video on just this one particular area. Grill tape should be adding downforce and reducing drag on the car. However, in this particular game, I've not found that that's the case. So I simply use a 0% there. I would love it if they would, do a patch that would correct this in the future so that I could use a grill tape setting and use that to help adjust the setup. But for now, that's not the case. Wheel lock, I've not changed at all. Steering offset, this is something that, if we go back to that discussion of the car pulling hard to the left on the straightaways, the steering offset is something that can help with that. The higher the number you use in steering offset, the more the car, it will sort of offset that pull to the left. Now you have to be careful here, because if you get the steering offset too high, the car will actually pull a little bit to the right. And again, this is something you can play around with, test out different values here, going, above and below the 0.15 that you see for this setup, and see how it affects your car. But in general, the higher the number you use for the steering offset, the more the car will want to pull to the right, which in this case for the setup will sort of offset the pull to the left that you get. The lower the number that you use for the steering offset in basically any setup in NASCAR Heat Evolution, the higher the number basically offsets the tremendous pull to the left that you get on the straightaways. And of course, the reason behind the pull on the hard pull to the left on the straightaway is because we want the car set up to turn left by default as much as we can get by with, because it simply makes the car go through the corners faster. So that's why it's there. But as always, there are ways that you can reduce that pull to the left, and steering offset is one of those. Let's move on finally to the gear settings. And as normal, I have not messed with the first through fourth gear ratios individually. Basically, the only thing I look for here is to make sure that fourth gear is at a 1.0 ratio. And what I've done is worked with the final gear, or what they call here the rear end ratio, and I've put it at 4.5 because that basically maxes out my RPMs at the end of the straightaways, putting me right up around 9,000. You can use this, as with everything else, to adjust the handling of your car. If you reduce that number, getting 4.2, maybe 4.3, it'll reduce the number of RPMs you're running on the straightaway, and by extension, reduce the number of RPMs you're turning in the corner, which can allow you on a short track like Richmond to be more aggressive on the throttle, and also can help the car to rotate better. So again, just another tool in the toolbox to use to control the handling of your car. Now, at this point, I'm going to show you a lap around Richmond replay for me. And in this particular case, I ran a 21.135, but of particular interest are your braking points. Pay most attention to when you want to be on and off the brakes, and then when you want to be on and off the throttle. You'll notice that at Richmond, you have the ability to be extremely aggressive. In fact, in the video, I would say that I actually, on this particular lap, I got on the brakes a little bit later than I wanted to. A split second before that, I really wanted to be on the brakes, but I was extremely aggressive on this particular lap to show you that you can really drive it down deep into the corner. And what you're doing, basically, you want to drive the car on the brakes right down to the bottom of the turn, right down next to the yellow line in both corners. That can give you the best potential lap time. But with that being said, don't be afraid to venture up into the second lane as well, as that can help the car to rotate if you're having trouble with the car drifting up the track in the corners. Don't be afraid to try the second groove and simply let the car rotate a little bit freer up in that second groove. Hope you enjoyed the video. Stay tuned for that lap around Richmond, and stay tuned for more NASCAR Heat Evolution.
That was your best lap ever.